I would love to introduce you to Stan Mitchell. He's Head of Business Development at natural materials expert Xampla. And I'm also joined by James Nelson, who is Business Development Manager at 2M Group of Companies. So, gentlemen, welcome to the webinar.
Thanks very much, Paul.
Yeah, thank you, Paul.
Really delighted to have you on board. So obviously we're going to continue this plastic reductions theme and find out a bit more about your companies and your products. So first of all, Stan, could you just introduce yourself and tell me a little bit about yourself and Morro Materials?
Absolutely. So I'm Stan, as you said, Head of Business Development at Xampla, but like most of the company, I have a background in biotechnology and life sciences from a range of industries that we draw from. And what we make at Xampla is a really new class of natural polymer. And I think we'll probably get into the importance of that classification. But quickly for the audience, what we call Morro materials that we're bringing to the market at the moment are a very different kind of natural polymer to a lot of things you might have previously had some chance to use or seen on the market. So we're not a starch, we're not a lipid-based system, we're a protein-based technology. And that means that Morro materials are able to offer some really high performance replacements to some of the most polluting forms of single use and specialty polymer out there.
Excellent, Stan. Thank you very much for your introduction. So James, over to you. Can you tell us a bit about yourself and what your company does?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Paul. So I'm James Nelson, Business Development for 2M Group of Companies. I've been with the company about 2 years, but I've spent my career pretty much in the packaging industry, both working for brand owners and manufacturers. And I'm really helping the company at the moment try and shape a direction for us for the future where we can transition our portfolio to more sustainable alternative technologies, which cover our whole range of industries. So just a bit about 2M itself. It's a holding group of companies anchored really in the material and life science industry. So we sell pretty much all chemicals that really go into a range of products that cover those industry segments. We have an industrial business which is focused on anything that goes into adhesives, coatings, elastomers, plasticizers, the whole spectrum of ingredients that go there. And then we have a brand facing side of the business, Surfachem, which really would supply any commodity chemicals that go into personal care formulations and developments. So a very broad, diverse portfolio of things, really, but really trying to help us shape our sustainability strategy going forward. So that's my role currently.
Excellent, James. Thank you very much for that. So I'm going to start with you, James, if I may. So as a supplier to the chemicals industry, do you see much change in the supply chain in response to sustainability? Nice easy one.
Yeah, it's a great question. There's probably a very long answer to it, but I think the simple one is yes. I think the industry itself is going to go through a process of change for sure over the next years. We've already seen legislation play a massive role in the packaging industry, and I think legislation is also going to play a massive role in the chemical industry as we, being a sort of service provider that supplies into the packaging industry indirectly in the terms of coatings, inks, varnishes, etc. We've seen a huge transformation start, but also is going to, I think, gather more pace. So lots of companies in the industry working on various options around sustainability in general. So reduction of scope 1 and 2 emissions, focusing on alternative energy sources, mass balance approaches to get a more, let's say, carbon beneficial portfolio of products. And then obviously a big ramp up as well in some of the more classified biopolymers itself. So polymers made from, bio-based feedstocks and the like, feeding the way into the industry. So there's absolutely, a number of things that are being taken. It's going to take a long time to transition and to really build that toolbox that will enable sustainable packaging development in the future, because we're still about 90% plus of the industry is reliant on fossil-based chemicals. So sustainable products, sustainable development definitely the building blocks of the future. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you very much, James. So that leads quite nicely, really, to ask Stan about what really interested to find out a bit more about Morro Materials and what are your biggest challenges for Xampla and Morro Materials.
Yeah, so it's really interesting to be in this sort of conversation and to have a chance to speak around alongside someone like you, James, obviously coming from the industry, because I think a lot of what you touched on there feeds really well into what we experience when we're talking about barriers for novel materials. And a big part of that is that it's just such a complex space. James was reading off there, carbon accounting, things about end of life management, things about biomaterials, sourcing, feedstock sustainability, end of life, etc. And I think actually for very innovative new natural polymers like the ones we produce at Xampla that we sell as Morro Materials, a really big hurdle to us is the degree of confusion and frankly the degree of greenwashing that does go on in the industry. And it's understandable why it becomes confusing because a category like biomaterials captures everything from bio-PET, which for all intents and purposes at end of life is a synthetic, all the way to the other end of the spectrum where Morro Materials live, which are natural polymers, chemically unaltered natural materials, which actually biodegrade very readily and with very good end of life, but are also quite different sometimes or handle and function in different ways to traditional synthetic materials. And actually, a lot of what we have to work through with clients and with prospects, Paul, is getting through that discussion about what do we mean by sustainable? What do we mean by biodegradable? And to make very clear that when we're talking about Morro Materials, we're not talking about something with chemical modification. And when we therefore talk about biodegradability and end of life, we mean biodegradability, whether it's in freshwater, the marine environment, soil, or of course, any kind of home or industrial composting. We're not playing the game of some biomaterials in the past of claiming biodegradability when what we actually mean is quite a carefully managed end-of-life scenario. And breaking through that really is one of our biggest challenges, as well as actually coming to understand how people like James in the industry see the landscape and how we can present and develop really impactful solutions for them.
Excellent. Well, why don't we ask James? So what are 2M's ambitions in terms of, sustainable chemistry and sort of double-edged question, really? What are 2M, why is 2M interested in this? So what are your ambitions and why, I guess?
Yeah, well, I think like most companies, we're embarking on our sustainability journey, and it is very much a journey. The industry itself is still very, very reliant on petrochemical feedstocks as an input to it, and the transformation is going to take time. There's a huge legacy of infrastructure investment, other things which are going to make that transition process a longer journey. But as part of our sustainability working group within 2M, we're also working on a strategy where across our portfolio we have lots of interesting materials that can have cross-functional purposes. So there's chemistries that we can find in personal care, for example, that have application potentials in other areas. So we're working on a product portfolio strategy review that will allow us to help our customers transition to more sustainable alternatives in the future. Because ultimately, I think considering where we sit in the supply chain, we're a feeder that goes into the industry that would make coatings, inks, adhesives. Stan's talked about end of life, compostability. These are all important things that are going to influence those factors when you look at combinations of materials and things. So our approach really is to try and help our customers achieve some of their sustainability goals by working on an R&D and a portfolio strategy that's going to give us a toolbox of options to help our customers achieve the net zero goals and the targets and the things that are going to drive change in the industry. So I'll give you an example. Biosolvents for the print industry is one of the things we've started. Lots of commodity solvents, commodity items, that are currently used in the coatings industry, particularly. I think technology-wise haven't really changed for a very long time, and they're still actually a big contributing source of plastic as well. So starting at least on more sustainable carbon-friendly solvents as a portfolio, and then working on portfolio replacement over time to feed into that space and help companies then build compostability into the products, using the mantra of safe, sustainable by design, which I think is what's really being pushed now through the chemical industry, particularly as we look forward.
And if I could just jump in there, Paul, actually, it's really interesting to hear that perspective from you, James, about the role of companies like 2M in bringing together a toolbox. Because I think one thing, probably a few people in the audience have heard quite a lot of green materials or green startups, talk about their solution like it's going to solve the whole problem. But I think we're very conscious at Xampla that Morro materials are developed to replace very specific kinds of plastic. And there's a very wide range of chemistry beyond polymers into other kinds of things like synthetic coatings or solvents, as James was talking about. And really creating impactful solutions is going to require a combination of those. And in part, it's about understanding how things like Morro coating, which is used for barrier functionality on things like food service, paper products, or things like Morro microencapsulates can directly displace plastics. But I think there's also a lot of potential here for companies like 2M, other companies already in the chemicals industry, to bring together all the different new technologies that are entering the market and find really exciting ways of combining them together. So, for example, thinking about how something like a Morro soluble film, like the image that's shown here, could be combined with other new chemical innovations inside the product or in the secondary or tertiary packaging to create something really, really novel. And actually go a bit beyond what traditionally was possible with synthetic solutions.
Excellent, Stan. So we've talked a lot, or you talked a lot about Morro materials. I'm quite keen to sort of find what applications have been tried or tested to date. So can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So films is a good place to start. They're probably the most visual and most recognizable thing that we make. Because Morro materials are really intended for replacing specialty polymers. So Morro soluble films were developed as a natural polymer alternative to materials like PBOH, so for soluble films on home care or cosmetics products. But again, just as I was talking about, this is a really good example of how, when you start to think differently about what kinds of materials you use, some very, very different product applications are opened up. So because we work with chemically unaltered plant protein, if we use a food-grade protein as an input, it's quite possible to make these soluble films, but have them as an edible material instead. And if anyone in the audience here is a Gusto user, you might have had a chance to eat some of the Morro edible soluble films earlier this year, which we sold in as a wrapper for a stock cube. So packaging that actually you could eat yourself as a consumer and provide a zero waste solution, but also a really, really different kind of consumer experience. And we've rolled that out across a lot of the things that we do with Morro materials. So just as we originally developed Morro micro encapsulation technology for things like fragrance or active ingredients in home care or agrochemicals, that same technology, that same chassis can be used to produce the Morro NutriParticles, which are actually a mechanism to deliver some really interesting nutrient fortification and enteric release benefits in things like soft drinks, where we've worked very closely with Britvic in the UK to develop some of those solutions.
Excellent. So some really good applications there. Really, really good. So, James, you mentioned about 2M being a multinational company. Are your challenges purely from a European phenomenon, or is it broader and wider than that?
Well, I think the industry in general, obviously, we represent a number of major manufacturers, major chemical principals. So we supply and distribute products for them, and they typically have an international footprint. So, a lot of companies will be driven by what their strategic goals are around sustainability, and typically we will see approaches and technologies that they develop filter the way down to us. We're a chemical distributor and manufacturer, if you like, in the middle ground area. So we're not a leading big manufacturer like a Dow or a Sun Chemical. We're somebody who sort of works with them and represents in certain territories. And so I think that, you know, the time it's going to take for sustainable technologies to filter through is a bit reluctant, a bit reliant. We're a bit reliant on our upstream supply chain, but we're also working, you know, with smaller suppliers and companies to help transition our portfolio. So, you know, sustainability is something hopefully that many people are going to take, many companies are going to take seriously. There's lots of things and areas that I think we can all partake in, not just relating to chemicals and how we use them and how we use them to make packaging, but also, you know, how we use energy, renewable energy sources. We've got some technologies that we're working with some companies on as well on the renewable energy side of things. You know, so yeah, so sustainability could be a topic we talk about for 20 hours because there's many different facets and directions and things that we could go in with it. But yeah, as a general rule, I think it's definitely, you know, an international issue, and it's going to be an international approach that's going to help drive it forward.
And I think to follow up on that, it's really interesting to hear that perspective, James, from a bit of a more experienced position. Because again, obviously, we're a UK company. We span out from the University of Cambridge, and a lot of the deployment of Morro materials and a lot of the direction of that development has been driven obviously by a European regulatory context. But I think just as you're saying, James, what we often find is that although things happen first here, a lot of our clients and partners are very interested in using Europe as a bit of a proving ground for these kinds of sustainable new materials, and then rolling them out into other territories once they've achieved a certain scale. I wonder, is that a pattern that you've seen with other innovations in the chemicals industry? It would be interesting to have a bit of a perspective beyond just sort of packaging materials, which we work in.
Yeah, it's a great question, Stan. I think obviously we're quite plugged into a number of the industry associations within the industry. So our chairman and CEO, Motti Kessler, he's chairman of the Chemical Business Association. We work with the BCF, the BPIF, a number of different industries in and around that segment. But obviously, one of the things that governs most of the chemical industry is the REACH process. And for those who aren't aware, it's every chemical that's used in any situation, environment, ingredient, etc., has to go through a classification process. And the REACH process historically has always looked at chemicals based on, you know, the inherent, I'd say, risks or hazards. So if it's a solvent, it's flammable, for example. I think when you look at the impact of the UN sustainability goals and how that's now influencing legislators, particularly in Brussels and other parts of the world, you know, I think absolutely you know, I've heard discussions and I've seen whispers on various forums, but references about taking an approach to REACH where effectively, rather than just looking at the chemical in its entirety as a hazard, it's looking at the life cycle impact of said chemical. So PFAS chemicals I think is one that's quite well documented that, you know, is going to be a challenge. But I think, you know, we're really at the tip of the iceberg. I think there's an awful lot of chemicals, ingredients, constituents that are, you know, if the REACH classification and the relevant bodies decide to go that way, I think he's going to massively change the landscape again in the future. So definitely want to keep an eye on. I think we're at the start of the journey, but I think ultimately taking a more holistic life cycle approach to the way we use materials, ingredients, packaging has got to be the way forward. And it's only going to change packaging if you've got ingredients and materials you can apply to packaging, which will help you get there.
And sorry, Paul, I don't want to hijack this one, but I just think that's such an important point, James, about how all parts of that supply chain are going to have to be working together. And one thing that we're very focused on with Morro Materials is to ensure that for their applications, these are drop-in solutions that can be processed and handled using the existing capital equipment that's already out there. So I think just as you're hinting at, if tomorrow there's sweeping legislation that changes the landscapes in, say, paper coatings, either you're going to have solutions like Morro coating, or you're going to have a lot of stranded capital equipment. And I think that's something that we often hear from some of our clients and partners, that what they're very focused on is that easy switch over. And it's something that I think more and more materials, not just Morro materials, as we go forward, are going to be focusing on to ensure that you can have that compatibility and that smooth switch over from synthetics to more natural or biodegradable solutions.
And Stan, I think quite a lot of people will be listening to what you're doing and want to find out a bit more about the end of life of Morro materials. What's the scenario for that?
So I think that's a really good point, and it's a really important thing for people to be live to, because as I said, there is a lot of confusion in this space. There has been a lot of greenwashing. And it's also very important to be clear about what Morro materials are intended for. So our material is not a thermoplastic. It's not intended to replace bulk polymers in, for example, well-recycled materials like plastic water bottles, for example. Really, Morro materials have been designed to replace specific specialty polymers in very, very highly littered or high environmental leakage risk applications. And that's why we focus on things like, for example, microparticles, which are very, very common in home care products like laundry detergent, for example, but will ultimately just be washed into the watercourses. And therefore, when we're bringing a natural solution to those kinds of materials, it's important for us that we're confident that the biodegradability is sufficient, that even if that water were not to be properly treated and it were to run into a fresh water stream or out into a marine environment, Morro materials would still degrade within the 30-day standard for biodegradability in those settings. And just the same thing when we talk about, for example, the Morro coatings for paper, that these don't in any way undermine or affect the recyclability or the biodegradability of those materials they're coated onto. And in fact, actually, given the data that we have around soil biodegradability and water biodegradability, we're actually very confident that because Morro materials are all chemically unaltered natural proteins, they will degrade very effectively, even in very, very uncontrolled ends of life. You're on mute, Paul, if you're saying something.
Yeah, it would be me, wouldn't it? So a couple of the last questions really sort of bring it all together. How are we going to create a solution at scale? And it's a real, it's a sort of $1 million question, $1 billion question, I guess.
James, do you want to take that one first?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think it's if you look around, there's lots of initiatives happening already. There's lots of challenges as well with actually bringing scale to solve some of these problems. There's lots of discussions around sustainable single use, reuse models, etc., and very well documented. I think we need all of them. I think we need a joined up approach, but I think the main thing, I think, or the key word, I think, is probably collaboration in terms of how we achieve it, because there's lots of I mentioned briefly associations as an example. So people may be familiar with things like ECMA, FEFCO, PPC. In the packaging space, there's a whole host of associations then that work with the chemical industry, and a whole host of associations that perhaps represent brands like RAP, and all these other organizations. And I think collaboration and actually some joined up approaches between all these things, for one, I mean, it's got to be a consistent message of how we take this to the key legislators and so we get sensible legislation, and we get time for actually companies as well to develop scale and to find and innovate alternatives. And then obviously we need new innovators and new technologies to come in and to help replace existing things. I think nature's solved most of our problems in life with natural polymers, natural materials, and I think looking more to nature as a solution through waste, taking carbon from a different point in its life cycle. The irony of oil being millions of years of degraded biomaterials, and actually I think we can be more smart about how we do that. So take it from a different point in its life cycle. If it's food waste, for example, there's another big area where we can plug into and look to find solutions. So yeah, it's definitely not an easy thing to address, but that's just some thoughts from me on how some of the challenges and things that we could look at more in the future.
I think I'll take that nice setup, James, around natural materials to say that the real challenge and the role for companies like Xampla that are innovating in this space, I think, is about making that scalability easy and working as much as we can on the compatibility. So although there is a lot of really clever biochemistry and protein science that goes on behind the scenes to make Morro materials, a big achievement of the company has been to generate a process for manufacture, which is a lot more like industrial cooking than it is complex chemistry, and actually doesn't require proprietary equipment and already runs on the kind of equipment that a lot of existing chemical manufacturers have. And as I said, that drop-in attitude has to run down the whole supply chain. So to make sure that you can make the films, you can make the coatings with the same kind of equipment and setup that's already been installed. And I think just the last part, which James touched on a little bit earlier, is about finding ways to harness the real enthusiasm that exists at that sort of B2C end and make sure that's driven through the whole supply chain, rather than finding solutions that maybe work for a small product launch or a bit of PR, but actually won't translate into the big kinds of material shifts that really we're focused on at Xampla.
Excellent. Well, Stan and James, thank you very much for your time.